There is a modern sickness called the loophole. It is the disease of the litigator, the negotiator, the man who believes that the laws of physics are just guidelines waiting to be settled out of court. They believe that if they can just find the right subclause, the right technicality, they can cheat the house. They look at the reaper and see a plaintiff. They look at the grave and see a breach of contract. They think that if they word the document perfectly, they can own the things that are meant to own us. But they forget that ink fades, paper rots, and some contracts are binding in ways that have nothing to do with the law. You've taken your seat in the back of the shop because you want to see what happens when a man tries to sue the inevitable. So pour your drink, dim the lights, the admission price has been paid. I'm the curator. My inventory is not for sale, but is occasionally for rent. Tonight the rent is due. Let the show begin.
The rain in this city doesn't wash anything clean. It just wets the grime until it slicks the streets like oil. It was a Tuesday, the kind of gray, weeping afternoon that makes you feel like the sun has filed for bankruptcy. I was watching Elias Thorne from the reflection of a puddle outside the courthouse, though he wouldn't have noticed me. To him, I was just a flicker of static in the periphery. Elias was a shark in a $3,000 suit, a man who treated the law not as a shield, but as a serrated knife. He was currently finishing up a demolition job in Deposition Room B. Across the table sat Madame Vina, a trembling woman in her 60s with too many shawls and a terrifying amount of debt. She ran a spiritual cleansing parlor that Elias's client, a mega developer, wanted gone.
Mrs. Gable,
Elias said, his voice smooth as polished granite. He didn't look at her. He was examining his cuticles.
let's review the timeline. You claim the property is a historical landmark due to, and I quote, spectral inhabitants of the antebellum period.
The spirits, they have rights.
Vina stammered, clutching a crystal pendant. Elias looked up then. His eyes were cold, dead things.
Ghosts do not have social security numbers, Mrs. Gable. They do not pay property taxes. Therefore, under state law, they are not tenants. You, however, are 3 months behind on a commercial lease.
But the energy vortex
Is not a zoning classification.
Elias interrupted, snapping a heavy binder shut. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the small room.
We are filing for summary eviction. You have 48 hours to vacate the premises, or the sheriff will remove your inventory. Have a pleasant afternoon.
He stood up, buttoning his jacket. He didn't feel bad. He didn't feel good. He felt nothing. To Elias, the supernatural was just another fraud practiced by the poor to annoy the rich. He thrived on crushing it. He loved the sound of belief snapping under the weight of a court order. That was his mistake. He thought the universe ran on statutes. He didn't know it actually runs on hunger. The shift happened 3 weeks later. It started with the blindingly mundane, a probate case involving a derelict speakeasy buried under the foundation of the old textile district. The blind tiger. The developers wanted it gutted. The local historical society claimed it was cursed. They said the basement distorted time. Elias went down there personally, not to hunt ghosts, but to find structural rot he could use to condemn the building. I was already there, lurking in the shadows of the dry rot, watching. The basement smelled of wet iron and trapped time. The air was heavy, pressing against the eardrums like deep water. Elias swept his flashlight beam over the damp brickwork. He sneered at the warding sigils painted on the walls in faded red paint.
Vandalism.
He muttered, dictating into his voice recorder.
Evidence of squatters.
Then he found the loose brick. It wasn't hidden by magic. It was hidden by good masonry. He pried it loose, revealing a hollow cavity. Inside sat a lockbox, rusted shut. Elias forced it open with a pry bar. The metal groaned, a sound almost like a human vocal cord snapping. Inside lay a ledger. It belonged to a mob accountant who vanished in 1929. Elias sat on a dusty crate, the damp cold of the basement seeping into his expensive wool trousers. He opened the book. He expected numbers. He expected a list of bribes. What he found were diagrams.
Geometry.
He whispered, tracing a shape that shouldn't have been able to exist on flat paper. It was a non-Euclidean angle. Just looking at it made the bile rise in his throat. His brain tried to reject the image, telling him the lines were straight, but his eyes saw the curve that went inward into a dimension that wasn't there. He looked at the shadows in the corner of the room. They weren't falling in the right direction. The light from his flashlight hit the wall, but the shadow of the crate stretched toward the light. Elias didn't scream. He didn't run. A normal man would have fled the madness. But Elias Thorne wasn't normal. He was a lawyer. He looked at the impossible geometry, then back at the ledger. He saw the rituals written not as prayers, but as procedures. Input A leads to output B. Sacrifice X yields result Y. He smiled. It was the smile of a man who had found a loophole in reality itself. He didn't see a curse. He saw an unregulated asset class. For the next month, the office of Thorne and Associates transformed. The interns were fired. The blinds were drawn. The air conditioning was set to freezing to keep the smell of sulfur down. Elias stopped shaving. The dark circles under his eyes looked like bruises. He wasn't casting spells. He was cross-referencing. He treated the incantations in the ledger like sub-clauses in a merger agreement. He translated Sumerian blood pacts into legalese. He realized that demons didn't want souls. They wanted transactions. And if it was a transaction, it could be litigated. He was drafting a contract, a hostile takeover of his own mortality. I materialized in his office on a rainy Tuesday night. The air conditioning hummed, a low, artificial drone that covered the silence of the empty building. I didn't burst in with fire. I just walked out of his executive washroom, drying my hands on a paper towel. Elias spun his Aeron chair around. He looked manic. He looked like a junkie about to hit the vein.
The adjuster.
He breathed. Mr. Thorne, I replied. My voice sounded like gravel grinding under a heavy tire. I wore a trench coat that had seen better centuries and lit a cigarette. The flame was purple. The smoke curled up, green and heavy, smelling of menthol and open graves. You summoned representation?
I summoned a counterparty.
Elias snapped. He stood up, slapping a thick sheaf of vellum onto his mahogany desk.
I've reviewed the precedents. I know the standard offer is eternal youth for a soul. That's a bad deal. High interest rates, balloon payments.
Standard market value? I shrugged, ash falling onto his Persian rug.
I'm not buying.
Elias said, his eyes bright with triumph.
I'm claiming squatters' rights on existence. I demand statutory permanence.
He slid the contract toward me. I picked it up. The paper felt hot, like feverish skin. I read the terms. Clause 4, Section B, exemption from cellular entropy, I read aloud. Clause 9, Section A, total immunity to kinetic force and physical trauma. You want to be a fixture, Elias, unchanging, unyielding, a distinct legal entity separate from the flow of time.
I want to beat the mountain,
he said, leaning over the desk.
I want to watch the stars burn out. And look at the indemnity clause. No soul forfeiture, no blood debt. Just a recognition of status.
Espresso and arrogance. He thought he had outlitigated God. Technically, I admitted, flicking the document with a fingernail that was slightly too yellow. This is airtight. The universal constant allows for anomalies, provided they are stable.
Then sign it,
he commanded.
Notarize me.
I pulled a quill from my coat. It dripped ink that looked uncomfortably like arterial spray. I signed the bottom line. The signature hissed, searing into the vellum like a brand on cattle. Motion granted, I whispered. Elias threw his head back and laughed. It was a jagged, ugly sound. He grabbed a heavy crystal decanter of scotch and smashed it against the side of his own head. The glass shattered into diamond dust. His skin didn't break. He didn't bruise. He didn't even flinch.
I am eternal.
He roared, the euphoria distorting his face.
I am the anchor. I am the unmovable object. I beat you. I beat the house.
Yes, I said, checking my watch. You did. I snapped my fingers. The sound was like a thunderclap inside a coffin. The office didn't vanish. The magic didn't sparkle. Gravity just suddenly remembered him. Elias stopped laughing. His knees locked, his arms pinned to his sides. Not paralyzed by nerve damage, but by density. To be unmovable, one must be heavy. To be permanent, one must be part of the foundation.
What is this?
He wheezed. He tried to step forward, but his feet were fused to the floor. The atoms of his Italian leather shoes were knitting together with the subfloor. You filed for permanence, Elias, I said, walking around the desk. I leaned in close. I could smell his terror now. It smelled like ozone. Do you know what happens to assets that cannot be destroyed? We don't leave them out in the open. The walls of the office began to bleed away. The luxury view of the skyline dissolved into the gray, wet morning of a construction site. The Persian rug became twisted rebar. The expensive walnut desk became jagged rock. Elias opened his mouth to scream, but the air was sucked away. We were standing at the bottom of a 60-foot pit, the foundation of the new Federal Reserve Vault. Above us, the sky was a small, jagged square of weeping gray clouds. You are the high-value asset, I said, looking up. The sound of grinding gears filled the air. A massive concrete chute swung over the pit, blocking out the light. Elias whimpered, his eyes bulging.
No, wait, I rescind the motion.
Contracts are binding, counselor, I said, stepping onto a service ladder. You wanted to be the foundation of something great. You wanted to support the weight of the world. The chute opened. It wasn't water that came down. It was tons of industrial-grade concrete, thick with jagged aggregate rocks, a landslide of gray permanence. It hit him. If he were mortal, he would have been crushed instantly, a quick, merciful death. But Elias was statutory permanent. He felt every ounce of it. I watched from the ladder as the gray sludge rose. It hit his waist. He thrashed, but the sheer weight pinned him against the earth. It covered his chest, squeezing the air out of his indestructible lungs. He would never need to breathe again, which was unfortunate, because the panic of suffocation would never end. The concrete rose to his chin. His eyes were rolling wild in his head, staring at me, begging, pleading for a death I could no longer give him. The sludge poured into his open, screaming mouth. It filled his throat, packing tight against his vocal cords, turning his scream into a wet, muffled vibration in the slurry. It pushed into his nose. It covered his eyes, plunging him into absolute, stinging darkness. The last thing I saw was his hand, frozen in a claw, reaching up before the gray tide swallowed it whole. The flow stopped. The pit was full, a flat gray slab of wet stone. I stood on the edge of the pit, the rain mingling with the fresh cement. Beneath the surface, deep in the dark, Elias was there, wide awake, eyes open against the grit, his mind racing at 1,000,000 miles an hour, screaming into the silence, trapped in a body that would never, ever break. He would be there when the bank opened. He would be there when the vault was installed over his head. He would be there in 1,000 years when the city crumbled to dust. I flicked my cigarette into the wet concrete. It gave a tiny green spark that hissed and died. Case closed, I muttered.
The transaction is complete. The inventory has been secured. Elias wanted to be a pillar of the community. He wanted to be a fixture, a permanent installation in the skyline that time couldn't erode. And he succeeded. He is the most stable thing in the city now. He learned the hard way that permanence is just a fancy word for trapped. He wanted to support the weight of the world, and the world happily let him. But don't think you're just an observer safe in the gallery. That's the comforting lie you tell yourself to keep the claustrophobia at bay. By listening, you've witnessed the contract, you know the loophole exists, and now you know the adjuster might be auditing your lease on life next. Do you feel that? The heaviness in your legs? The feeling that gravity's pulling on you a little harder than it did 10 minutes ago? That's the cement setting. If you want to keep the movement free for another week, if you want to avoid becoming a fixed asset in the curator's collection, you know the ritual. Leave a like and subscribe. It's a small offering to the algorithm. A little bit of digital friction to prove to the machine that you're still moving, still breathing, and not ready to be poured into the foundation just yet. The shop is closing now. Until the next movement, sleep.